What's up guys, Asian here again, and this is another PTS video, and today we're taking a look at the Magplar changes that they've made. So we made a couple of changes to how Templar abilities have worked on Wolfhunter, and I kind of held off on doing a video on the Magicka Templar DPS, mainly because on the ESO Live, they did say they were going to buff J-Beam, so I just kind of wanted to wait to see what they did with J-Beam, and then do my tests from there, see whether or not it's worth running J-Beam in the rotation again, because a lot of Magplars are saying J-Beam's actually a DPS loss during execute just because it doesn't do as much execute damage as it should. Now, the couple of changes that they have made, we're just going to quickly summarize them. So they're all based on the class abilities here. So they changed, first of all, they changed Solar Barrage, so it's an instant cast, but they ended up reducing the damage by 40%. So what I'm going to do, show you guys, is kind of my test with Solar Barrage, and then I replace Solar Barrage with Purifying Light instead, and then you guys can compare the DPS difference. It is a DPS loss. It's a pretty hefty DPS loss, even though you do gain a global cooldown. The 40% reduction in damage is a really big hit, so it actually ends up being a DPS loss overall to use Solar Barrage over Purifying Light. And then for J-Beam, they have increased the amount of execute damage by, I think it was originally like 350 or 380, and now they bumped it up to 480 instead. The initial buff was up to 400, but they buffed it even more now to 480. So it's a pretty substantial boost to the execute damage, so it's going to be interesting to see just how high you're able to get these ticks to hit with like full raid buffs and everything. And then one big change here is the challenge focus. So instead of having it be basically an 8-second buff that's refreshed every time you are in the rune, now it is just a flat 20-second duration, so you can cast and then continue to move around, and you don't have to worry about going back to the rune to refresh that 8-second duration. And as long as you're standing in the rune, you gain an additional 50% physical and spell resistance. So it's basically like you have Major Ward, Major Resolve, plus a half, so you get additional 2640 additional resistances while you're standing in the rune. So that gives you, if I'm doing my math right, it'll give you 7920 resistances while you're standing in the rune. So this is a fairly decent buff to particularly healers, DPS, and tanks. It's across all three. They initially had boosted, they basically had doubled the cost of this ability initially, then they reverted that change. So now it is a pretty good skill here. So the initial skill lasted for, I believe it was 16 seconds, so you could get theoretically 24 seconds out of it because that 8-second buff does last after the rune disappears. So it is a slight decrease to the total duration, but overall, now that you're able to move around and maintain the buffs, that's generally very good for DPS healers and tanks, so that way you don't have to necessarily worry about going back to your rune circle. Overall, it is a slight nerf because you do lose that little bit of that duration there, but generally speaking, you recast it anyways when your rune runs out, so it's not that big of a nerf overall. So overall, I would consider it a kind of like not a buff, not a nerf, kind of a middle ground, so it doesn't really change too much. So obviously the big thing here is now J-Beam is a really nice execute, 480% additional damage to enemies below 50% health. So what I'm going to show you guys today is kind of what I think is going to probably be, assuming nothing changes between next week and the week after when we believe Wolfhunter will go live, what I think it's going to be. So the big question that a lot of people had was whether Solar Barrage would be worth running anymore due to the decrease in damage. So I'm going to run one parse with Purifying Light, and you guys can check out my bars here real quick. So in terms of gear, it's the same Zon, Perfect Sororia, and Mother Sorrow. So I do have 3 spell damage glyphs. Now for my Mother Sorrow, I have infused flame damage, and then on my back bar here I have a Maelstrom Inferno staff, but I haven't absorbed Magicka enchant. Magplar sustain is still kind of crap. It's only really beaten out by Sorks in terms of how bad sustain is, so we are using an absorbed Magicka glyph here in order to help out our sustain a little bit. I've tried out also replacing one of these glyphs with a Magicka regen glyph, and then replacing this with a shock damage glyph, and that worked out pretty decently as well, so you can really go with either one, but I'm just going with absorbed Magicka enchant on the back bar here because they did change it so that the enchant on your back bar will go off as long as you have a weapon ability that was cast on that back bar. So we have block 8 up pretty much all the time, so we're always going to get that Absorb Magicka enchant going on cooldown. So that pretty much gives us an additional about it's basically an equivalent of about 230, about 200 additional regen. So 1132 is really going to be closer to about 1332 or something like that. So that's really nice there. Of course, if you do have the Magicka regen glyph, it's lower overall, but it is boosted by CP points and any sort of passives you get, so major intellect, things like that. So it is greater overall in terms of staying there. So I'll basically do a quick parse, well, 2 quick parses here. So the first one's going to be with Purifying Light, the next one's going to be with Solar Barrage, and then I will basically do one where I swap out one of these glyphs with a Magicka regen and swap this out with a Shock glyph, and then we can compare the DPS there. So my front bar here, so we do need to make sure we have Spear passive, Adric Spear ability, and then Retro ability. So we have Blazing Spear on the front bar, and then Crescent Empowering Sweep on the back bar, and then we have Blockade and Fiery Rage. So we have all of our passives where we need them to be. Let's go ahead and get started here. See here, there is a little bit of lag here on the PTS. These parses are probably not what I could hit if I didn't have any lag at all. So I am using the Dasher ult as my primary damage ult here. So I'm not using Empowering Sweep. And I will start J-beaming at 25%. See here, compared to Nightblade Sustain, it's pretty bad overall. So I drop Vampbane. So I mean, we are able to get into Execute. A decent amount of Magicka still left over. Okay, so that was with Purifying Light. I know, like I said, there is lag on the PTS. PTS is generally less robust than the live server, so there is a little bit of lag, and you know my internet's not great. So this is what we're looking at, about 4:1, 820. Now, one thing I do want to keep in mind here is that your CP distribution might change a little bit here because Purifying Light can't crit. So you can see here, none of the Purifying Light, at least the second blast, so the initial blast can crit. So if you take a look here, Purifying Light, this is the initial hit, so that can crit, but the second one can't crit. Generally speaking, Purifying Light will only make up about 5% of your DPS, so when you combine it with Zon, it's only about 10% of your damage is overall is not incritable. So you're still going to be looking at about 61 points into Elfborn, but there is going to be a slight change potentially in your CP distributions. It's probably going to be very, very small. I just go with this particular setup here. So 64 Elemental Expert, 16 Spell Erosion, 61 Elfborn, 61 Master at Arms, 21 Staff Expert, 37 Thaumaturge. You can see here that the difference here is pretty small overall, so I'm just keeping this here. The factor here doesn't really change too much. So this is with Purifying Light. So now what we're going to do is we're going to change out Purifying Light for Solar Barrage. Now, I didn't change anything else, I just swapped out those 2 skills. Now, the 2 things you got to pay attention to here is 1, sustain, and then 2, damage. So the metric to beat here is 41.8. So we'll see if we're able to beat that with Solar Barrage. The other thing with Solar Barrage too is that it's kind of dependent on your weaving. So if you're really bad at weaving, it's not going to be quite as strong. Because remember, it gives you in power, which boosts your light attack damage. See here right now, the damage is pretty comparable. See whether or not this will last. Generally speaking, the two parses that I've done have been pretty close together, but it's mostly change and sustain that I'm sure you guys might have already noticed. Solar Barrage is a little bit more expensive to cast than Purifying Light. You can see here some of my abilities are already starting to gray out, trying to, there we go, managed to make it to the potion, but that potion's not going to last me very long. And remember, I only change out the abilities, so gear is still the same, rotation is still kind of the same. You're pretty much like out of magic at this point, going into execute. So we drop Vamp Bane and we drop Solar Barrage. That's the other thing too. You're dropping Solar Barrage versus Purifying Light. You can reasonably add that into your rotation during execute. It won't necessarily be pretty, but it's doable. So it's not that much of a difference. It's only about 400 DPS difference, so it's not that big. So again, it's been kind of going back and forth between like 500 to 1.5k DPS difference, but generally speaking, Purifying Light is better overall, and your regen versus drain here. So 1497 to 1633, 1481 to 1593. So it's a little bit easier to sustain using Purifying Light, and that's mainly because of the cost. Purifying Light is cheaper to cast, same duration, so it's easier to sustain with Purifying Light. You're looking at about 1k additional magicka every 6 seconds with Solar Barrage, so not that great overall. But they're pretty comparable, so you can really pick whichever one, but Purifying Light is going to be a little bit stronger. So now what I'm going to do, like I said, is I'm going to swap out one of the damage glyphs for a... Oh, that's alchemy. Don't want alchemy. Going to swap out one of the damage glyphs for a regen glyph, and then we're going to add in a shock enchant on the back bar, and then we can see how that impacts our DPS overall. So remember that the magicka regen glyph on our jewelry will be affected by our passive, so CP points, if you're a high elf, your regen glyph, your regen passive there will boost it, major intellect will boost it. So we're starting at 1362, so you can already tell compared to the original 1132, you know, it's more than the advertised 169, and it will only increase once we get major intellect going as well. So remember, so this is going to be with Purifying Light, so the metric to beat is 41.8. So let's keep an eye on the sustain overall. The other thing too that we're going to do is also we're going to adjust for minor vulnerability. Because with the shock enchant, we're definitely going to have higher minor vulnerability uptime, and that is going to give us a slightly, it's automatically going to give us a better parse, just because of the additional 8% damage that the target dummy is taking because of that minor vulnerability. So there we go. So we're hitting almost 45k, and in terms of drain versus regen, 1369 to 1586 compared to 1481 to 1593. So in terms of drain, regen versus drain, this is worse overall, at least the way that we're doing the rotation right now, it is worse overall. And then when we adjust for the minor vulnerability uptime, we had a minor vulnerability uptime of 60%. And let's see what the other one was. The other one was 8%. So let's just say it's a 50% increase in minor vulnerability uptime. I'm just going to do the math off screen real quick for you guys. So that basically, if you want to do the math, it's basically, you basically have to make up for that difference somehow, right? So minor vulnerability, again, is 8% increase to damage dealt. Now that's not going to be like a flat 8% increase to your DPS, just because of the way the damage system works. It's actually going to be a little bit lower than that 8%, but you still want to adjust for that minor vulnerability. So it's about a 50% minor vulnerability uptime, which means we're looking at an additional approximately 4% damage dealt. Remember, half of 8 is 4, so 4% additional damage dealt. So basically what we have is, we have our two numbers, right? So we have 44,987, and that has to be equal to 41,820 times 1.04. So if we do that math real quick, I'm doing this off screen, by the way, on a calculator. So 41,820, and you want to multiply that by 1.04. That'll give us 43,492.8. So in other words, if we had about 60% minor vulnerability uptime on this particular parse, the 41.8 parse, we'd be looking at about 43.4, 43.5k. So it does seem like if you want to pull out the most DPS, and again, this is actually not that bad. If you had Orbs, if you had Worm, it actually wouldn't be terrible in terms of sustain. So we're looking at about 45k with a melee build with Magplar. So this is definitely a buff to our overall DPS as a Magplar. The changes to the back bar enchant going off on weapon damage, weapon abilities that are cast on the back bar, along with the huge buff to J-Beam, makes it a pretty nice execute move. So you can see here we got max hit of 51k. Previously, J-Beam was only hitting for maybe like 40k if you got lucky. So this is a really nice buff overall to Magplar DPS. Now I do have to run some more tests, particularly with Sorks and Nightblades. I don't think, obviously, Magblades are pulling higher. Magblades are pulling 50k on 6 million dummies. Of course, that's with Minor Berserk as well. So if we had Minor Berserk here, that's an additional 8% additional damage done. So just add that in, 44,987 times 1.08, and you're looking at 48.5k if we had full Minor Berserk uptime on a 6 million dummy. So we're still shy of of Nightblades by about 2k when we're in melee range, but that is a nice buff if you think about it. 2k within within 2k of a Magic and Nightblade is actually not that bad. And again, Minor Berserk, because it's damage done, it's not going to scale. It's not like an 8% increase in DPS. It's usually going to be a little bit less, so you're probably looking at closer to 48 or 47, high 47Ks. So you're still going to be behind on Magblades. So I'm pulling about 50k or so on my Magblade. So it is definitely not as good as the Magblade, but I do want to try to compare this to Sorks, particularly with a ranged build with Sorks and Nightblades, because not all fights are you're able to use Zon. So those fights where you're not able to use Zon, where you have to use Scoria instead, I want to see between pretty much all the classes, so Wardens, Sorks, Nightblades, and Templars, where they all stand now that Templars have been buffed. We'll see how they all play out. So that's it for this video. If you guys have any suggestions for testing things on the PTS, there haven't been a lot of balance changes, so that's why there's not quite as many videos here compared to Somerset, which is a pretty big change overall. So if you guys have anything you want me to test, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below, and I'll try to test them. I am still in the process of moving, and I will be going on vacation, or not vacation, but I'm going to be working, but I will be gone overseas for all of August. So my recording will not be quite as good there, but I'll try to get through as many tests as you guys want to see over these next two weeks. That's it for this video. Hope you guys found it informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.